The defensive belt was supposed to be the hardest part. For 3 days, the armor had ground its way through minefields, pre-sighted artillery zones, and dug-in anti-tank guns. The company commander reached for his radio headset to confirm the coordinates of the trailing supply echelon. He expected the familiar chatter of the logistical net. The accordion stretched back out. The supply chain breathed once more, and the lifeblood of the offensive resumed its forward flow. The mechanics had successfully unblocked the road, but the delay had already triggered a dangerous consequence. In the hour it took to drag the dead tank aside, the lead fighting company had pushed another 10 miles deeper into the open country. The vanguard was now severely overextended, sitting far beyond the protective reach of the main force. Now that the narrow road was open, the traffic control officers in the rear faced a critical priority. The bottleneck was clear, but the dirt track could still only handle one vehicle at a time. The stranded vanguard desperately needed fuel to keep moving, and they needed infantry to secure their flanks. But neither of those supplies mattered if the lead tanks were suddenly attacked by an organized defense. Of all the thousands of vehicles waiting in the rear, one specific asset had to be rushed through the newly opened gap, before anything else. The survival of the entire Spearhead depended entirely on the speed of the heavy guns. The bottleneck was finally cleared. The ruined tank had been dragged into a ditch, and the road was open. He expected a nearby rendezvous point. Instead, he heard nothing but the rhythmic, hollow hiss of an empty frequency. 10 miles ahead, the vanguard commander sat in the oppressive silence of the tree line, waiting for the fuel trucks he desperately needed to resume the advance. But the traffic control officers stationed at the crossroad behind the front lines did not prioritize gasoline. Fuel could keep a tank moving, but only high explosives could keep it alive. The first convoy waved. Through the newly opened gap was not a line of supply trucks, but the heavy prime movers of the field artillery. The greatest vulnerability of a rapidly advancing armored column is not running out of gas. It is outrunning its own fire support. A tank is a devastating offensive machine, but its thick steel hull limits visibility to narrow glass prisms. When a spearhead blindly hits a concealed line of heavy anti-tank guns or faces a concentrated infantry ambush in a tight village, the lead tanks cannot simply shoot their way through. They require an immediate, protective umbrella of high explosives, called down over the radio, to shatter the enemy defense before it can destroy the vanguard. This absolute requirement creates a severe physical constraint on the speed of the offensive. A standard heavy field gun in the 1940s could throw a high-explosive shell roughly 7 miles. If the armored vanguard is driving forward at 15 miles per hour, they will literally drive out from under there. The tanks pulled into the cover of a long tree line to wait. Engines were cut. The sudden silence of the battlefield was unnerving. Own protective umbrella in less than 30 minutes. To prevent the spearhead from being abandoned, the artillery cannot sit safely in the rear. It must constantly move forward directly behind them. This continuous leapfrogging was known as displacement, and it demanded an enormous logistical footprint. A battery did not just consist of the guns. It included the massive armored tractors, the heavily loaded trailers carrying 50-pound artillery shells, the fire direction center vehicles, and the wire-laying jeeps that maintained communication networks. Displacing a battery was an exhausting, brutal process. The gun crews had to unlimber in a muddy field, drop their heavy steel trails spades into the earth, and fire their assigned missions. The moment the vanguard advanced toward the edge of their range, the crews had to frantically dig those heavy spades out of the dirt, hoist the 2-ton weapons, and lock them onto the towing hooks of the prime movers. Once hooked up, the artillery battery became a clumsy, sprawling convoy. Tractors towing heavy artillery pieces were incredibly difficult to maneuver. They had terrible turning radii, sluggish acceleration, and were completely helpless. If they slid off a slick, unpaved road into a soft ditch, yet they had to be pushed down the exact same narrow dirt track that the tanks, the recovery vehicles, and the fuel trucks were trying to use. If the guns stayed parked in the rear to keep the post-apo, broken only by the metallic ticking of 30 hot exhaust pipes cooling in the evening air, road clear for supply trucks, the vanguard would be annihilated the moment it met serious resistance. But if the heavy guns took over the dusty road entirely, the fuel could never reach the front, and the tanks would stall anyway. The true speed of the breakthrough was not dictated by the tracks of the tanks, but by the turning wheels of the artillery tractors. The entire division was trapped in a lethal scheduling conflict. The vanguard needed to move, the recovery crews needed to clear wrecks, the fuel trucks needed to supply the line, and the heavy guns needed to leapfrog forward. They all required the same 15-foot wide strip of dirt at the exact same moment. Left to the commanders on the ground, the result would be a disorganized shouting match of competing priorities, ending in total paralysis. Someone had to impose ruthless order on the chaos, deciding exactly who lived, who waited, and who owned the road. The chaos of tens of thousands of competing vehicles could not be resolved by the men driving them. If a tank commander desperate for fuel met an artillery captain desperate to deploy his battery at a narrow bridge, the result was a bitter standoff. Both men believed their mission was the division's highest priority. Left alone, they would lock the road in a futile argument of rank. The crews climbed out and looked back down the single dirt road they had just traveled. It was entirely empty. To prevent this paralysis, successful armies stripped the combat commanders of their right to navigate. They handed absolute authority over the road to the military police. Standing in the center of a dust-choked rural intersection, an exhausted traffic control officer held more immediate power over the speed of the offensive than a frontline general. He was the human valve in the division's mechanical artery. His weapon was not a rifle, but a meticulously drafted document called a march table. The march table was a rigid, mathematical schedule generated by staff officers miles in the rear. It divided the road network into blocks of time, assigning exact minutes for specific units to pass certain checkpoints. It recognized that the dirt track was a finite resource. If the artillery was scheduled to cross a stone bridge at noon, the fuel trucks were ordered to wait in a holding area 3 miles back until 1 o'clock. If a supply convoy missed its assigned window because of a flat tire or a wrong turn, it did not simply merge late. The military police would aggressively force it off the road, making it wait hours for a new slot rather than letting it disrupt the displacement of the heavy guns. The dust of their own advance had already settled. According to the operational plan, a massive column of support vehicles should have been right on their heels. Enforcing this discipline was brutal, thankless work. Traffic control networks operated like a manual railway switching yard. Military police hammered wooden directional signs into tree trunks, strung miles of white tape along muddy shoulders to mark safe verges in the dark, and ran field telephone wire between critical intersections. They stood in the blinding, choking dust kicked up by passing tank treads, breathing exhaust fumes for hours. When a vehicle broke down, they blew their whistles and physically directed the heavy recovery wreckers through the gridlock to drag the obstruction away. They were ruthless. If a high-ranking officer in a command car attempted to bypass a crawling ammunition convoy, an enlisted military policeman had the standing authority to step into the road and stop him. If the officer refused, the vehicle could be shoved into a ditch. Road discipline was the only thing standing between operational momentum and total logistical collapse. At night, the pressure multiplied. To hide the massive column from enemy bombers, the entire division moved under strict blackout conditions. Headlights were forbidden. Drivers followed the vehicle ahead by staring intensely at tiny, shielded slit lamps that were completely invisible from the air. A driver exhausted by 3 days of combat could easily drift off the road, burying his heavy truck in a ravine and instantly severing the line. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, motorized infantry, and heavy-towed artillery were supposed to flow into the vacuum the tanks had created. The traffic controllers stood in the pitch blackness, listening to the agonizing grind of heavy gears, trying to keep thousands of blind machines moving in a straight line. When the march table was respected, the system was a masterpiece of hidden organization. It pushed fuel, high explosives, and recovery equipment forward in perfectly timed waves, keeping the vanguard fueled and protected. But this intricate choreography relied entirely on a single, fragile assumption. The staff officers drawing the schedules assumed the enemy was retreating. They calculated road capacity based on predictable movement, not combat. The march tables did not account for panic. They did not calculate what would happen if the column was suddenly forced to fight for the road it was already using. The system worked perfectly on paper, managing traffic with mathematical precision. The true test of road discipline was whether it could survive the moment the enemy returned to exploit the bottleneck. The silence in the tree line finally shattered. It was not the rumble of arriving fuel trucks, but the supersonic crack of a high-velocity armor-piercing shell. The lead tank of the vanguard violently lurched as the round punched cleanly through its steel turret. Seconds later, the heavy thud of an enemy anti-tank gun rolled across the open field. The retreating enemy had not simply vanished. They had fallen back, regrouped, and were now launching a localized armored counterattack directly into the face of the stalled Spearhead. That tail was the lifeline that made the armored fist lethal. An hour passed. Then two. The vanguard commander instantly grabbed his radio handset. His tanks were running on empty, immobilized in a defensive crescent, and facing fresh enemy armor. He did not need fuel anymore. He desperately needed the heavy artillery that was supposed to be leapfrogging directly behind him. He broadcast the coordinates of the approaching enemy vehicles and called for an immediate barrage of high explosives to break the assault. The radio crackled. The artillery battery commander answered, but his response was a death sentence. The guns could not fire. 10 miles down the dirt road, the intricate march table had completely collapsed. The system had failed exactly where the mathematical plan met human exhaustion. An hour earlier, a heavy supply truck had blown a tire and slewed sideways, blocking the narrow track. The military police had blown their whistles, halting the column to wait for the armored recovery wrecker. But the road discipline had unraveled. A junior officer in a trailing ammunition convoy, terrified of being caught stationary in the open, had ordered his drivers to bypass the wreck. The lead ammunition truck immediately sank to its axles in the soft mud of the shoulder, permanently wedging itself against the first broken vehicle. The road was now totally impassable. Caught directly behind this mess was the heavy artillery battery. The massive tractors and their towed field guns were bumper to bumper. The radio remained useless. The horizon behind them, which should have been choked with the brown dust of 2,000 advancing vehicles, was perfectly clear. When the frantic call for fire support came in from the vanguard, the artillery crews were helpless. To shoot, a heavy field gun must be unhooked, rotated, and its thick steel trail spades must be buried into solid earth to absorb the massive recoil. But the guns were boxed in. There was no room to swing the barrels. There was no solid ground to drop the spades. They were trapped in a steel canyon of idling trucks. Miles ahead, the vanguard paid the price for this traffic jam. Without the protective umbrella of friendly artillery, the immobilized tanks were systematically picked off. The enemy gunners maneuvered freely, using the terrain to their advantage, firing into the vulnerable flanks of the stranded company. The frontline tank crews fought back fiercely, but they were mathematically doomed. They were fighting a mobile enemy while anchored to the ground. Within 30 minutes, the vanguard was completely destroyed. Plumes of thick, oily black smoke marked the graves of the lead company. The spearhead of the great offensive had been decapitated. The defending military force had not deployed a massive, superior army to achieve this victory. They had simply recognized the vulnerability of the breakthrough. The defending commander understood that an armored column at the absolute limit of its advance is incredibly fragile. Finally, a lone scout car rattled up the dirt road from the rear. The liaison officer inside was covered in grit and exhausted. He did not need to fight the entire division. He only needed to strike the head of the snake at the exact moment the tail was tangled. This catastrophic failure was a brutal lesson in operational reality. The destruction of the vanguard was not a failure of tank design, crew bravery, or even the initial breakthrough plan. It was a failure of the invisible machinery of movement. But this localized disaster forces a deeper comparison. How did the most successful military forces prevent this exact scenario from destroying their major offensives? The burning vanguard was a tactical triumph for the defenders, but it fed a dangerous illusion. To an observer looking through binoculars, it appeared that superior marksmanship and better anti-tank tactics had halted the offensive. They could see the shattered armor and the retreating survivors. What they could not see was the 15-mile traffic jam that had actually sealed the vanguard's fate. This blindness to the logistical reality defined the difference between armies that could only win local battles and armies that could conquer continents. The military forces that ultimately failed at deep exploitation often shared a common cultural blind spot. They treated the tank as an independent, solitary weapon. Their factories poured immense resources into designing vehicles with thicker armor plating and longer, more lethal main guns. Then, suddenly, the line shattered. The surviving tanks of the Vanguard Company poured through the gap. He delivered a situation report that defied all tactical logic. The rest of the division was not coming, but they neglected the unglamorous, heavy machinery required to keep those tanks moving. They continued to rely on horse-drawn transport to move large portions of their artillery. They built too few heavy armored recovery vehicles. Their supply columns were a chaotic mix of civilian trucks and captured enemy vehicles, completely lacking standardized repair parts. When these armies achieved a breakthrough, their armored spearheads were devastating but brittle. They could sprint for a few days, but the moment friction set in, a muddy road, a mechanical breakdown, or a seized transmission, the entire offensive shattered under its own weight. The armies that mastered the art of rapid exploitation took a fundamentally different approach. They understood that a fast tank was entirely useless without a fast road. Instead of merely building better fighting vehicles, they built an interlocking system of movement. For every tank that rolled off their assembly lines, these nations produced dozens of heavy, all-wheel drive trucks. They manufactured massive fleets of specialized prime movers and dedicated heavy-duty wreckers equipped with powerful winches. Rather than relying entirely on towed artillery that could get trapped in traffic jams, they increasingly mounted their heavy field guns directly onto tracked chassis. These self-propelled guns could plunge into the soft fields alongside the tanks, fire their high-explosive missions, and keep moving without ever blocking the vital dirt tracks. The entire armored column, stretching 15 miles back to the original breakthrough point, had ground to a complete halt. When one of these integrated armies punched through a defensive line, they did not just send a vanguard forward. They pushed a rolling, mechanized city through the gap. Behind the lead tanks came combat engineering battalions carrying miles of prefabricated steel matting to instantly reinforce soft mud. The military police were highly organized, heavily equipped, and operated with absolute authority over the march tables. This was the invisible engine of deep battle. It was a logistical philosophy that prioritized continuous flow over individual vehicle firepower. If a tank broke its transmission, the system did not pause to fix it. The wrecker dragged the 30-ton casualty into a ditch. The traffic controller blew his whistle, and the supply trucks kept rolling. The artillery never stopped leapfrogging, and the vanguard was never left exposed. The enemy could not isolate the Spearhead because it was constantly fed, protected, and propelled forward by the sheer industrial weight of the column behind it. Yet, building this massive synchronized system of trucks, tractors, and traffic schedules was only the theoretical half of the equation. A march table drawn in a warm command tent is perfect. In the field, the system did not run on mathematics or engine oil alone. To keep the road open, the heavy guns firing, and the tanks moving, the vanguard was now stranded. They had no fuel to push forward. They lacked the fuel to retreat. The army had to demand an agonizing physical toll from the men forced to live inside the machinery. The silence in the tree line was absolute. The vanguard commander, sitting in the open hatch of his stranded tank, did not know the exact details of the 15-mile traffic jam behind him. He only knew that the fuel gauge read empty, the radio was dead, and the horizon was devoid of the heavy artillery he needed to survive. He had believed the pre-war doctrine. He had believed that breaking the enemy line and driving 25 miles into the open country was the definition of victory. But he had not been defeated by an opposing army. He had been defeated by the unforgiving physics of a dirt road. The question of rapid armored exploitation was never really about the top speed of a medium tank or the thickness of its frontal plating. It was about the brutal, invisible system required to sustain that momentum. A breakthrough was not a cavalry charge. It was a massive industrial machine forced through a fragile, narrow artery. The true speed of a victorious offensive was measured entirely by how fast a broken vehicle could be dragged into a ditch, how strictly an ammunition convoy could adhere to a timetable. Worst of all, they were entirely beyond the range of their own heavy artillery. If the retreating enemy realized how isolated this Spearhead actually was, and how quickly a heavy field gun could be unlimbered in the mud. But that system did not run automatically. The grand operational arrows, drawn by generals on pristine maps, were propelled entirely by the sheer physical exhaustion of the men trapped in the column. For the Spearhead to survive, the rear echelons had to be pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. The drivers of the supply trucks and artillery tractors spent days awake, wrestling with unsynchronized gearboxes, their hands blistered, their eyes burning from dust and diesel fumes. At night, under strict blackout conditions, they stared until their vision blurred at the tiny shielded tail lamp of the vehicle 50 yards ahead, knowing that drifting off the narrow road for even a second could snap the lifeline of the entire division. The artillery crews lived in a continuous loop of agonizing labor. Every time the vanguard advanced, these men had to manually dig heavy steel trail spades out of the compacted earth, hoist the 2-ton guns onto the towing hooks, and ride on the bouncing steel fenders of their tractors, only to do it all over again, miles down the road. They lifted millions of pounds of high-explosive shells by hand, rushing to keep the protective umbrella firmly over the tanks. They could turn and wipe out the company in a matter of minutes. The commander stared at his map, and in the center of the chaos were the recovery crews and the military police. They were the men who never saw the glory of the open breakthrough. They spent the offensive breathing the choking dust of passing convoys, wrestling heavy wire tow cables in the rain, and shouting over the deafening roar of idling engines. They were forced to make the ruthless decisions, dragging 30-ton casualties off the road and abandoning them in the mud so the rest of the division could live. A tank alone is simply a steel box waiting to run, out of fuel. It only becomes a weapon of strategic victory when an entire, synchronized world of logistics moves flawlessly behind it. The great armored thrusts of the war were not won by the vehicles at the very front of the line. They were won by the exhausted men standing miles in the rear. Long after the lead tanks had disappeared over the horizon, the true architects of the breakthrough remained behind. Standing at the center of a ruined intersection, coated entirely in a thick layer of white road dust, a solitary military policeman raised his arm. With a sharp blast of his whistle, he pointed a grease-stained glove down the narrow dirt track, waving the next heavy artillery tractor forward into the dark. The terrain was flat. There were no blown bridges behind them. There were no reported enemy ambushes on the supply route, and the skies were completely clear of enemy aircraft. The opposing army was beaten, yet the victorious division had paralyzed itself. A force capable of shattering a heavily fortified front line had somehow been defeated by miles of empty dirt road. To understand how a victorious Spearhead could be completely stranded without a single enemy shot being fired, we first need to understand what the men inside those lead tanks believed about the weapon of speed. The commander in the lead vehicle watched the speedometer needle hold steady at 20 miles per hour. Ahead of them lay nothing but open, undefended country. Before the first shot of the war was fired, the battle was already won on the sand tables of military academies. Staff officers pushed wooden blocks representing armored divisions across vast topographical maps. With a flick of a croupier's rake, a mechanized force bypassed a fortress, severed a rail line, and enveloped an enemy army. The arrows drawn on the acetate overlays were always broad, sweeping, and uninterrupted. To the theorists of the 1930s, the tank was not merely a mobile gun, it was the mechanical resurrection of the cavalry. The trauma of the previous World War years, spent bleeding for hundreds of yards of shattered mud, had birthed a desperate need for a weapon of decision. Armor was the answer. Doctrine dictated that once infantry and engineers cracked the defensive line, the tanks would be unleashed into the green fields beyond. Their primary defense would not be their welded steel plating, but their sheer velocity. Speed would paralyze the opposing command structure. Generals believed that a fast-moving column would constantly outpace the enemy's ability to communicate. If the tanks drove fast enough, they would render counterattacks obsolete before the defending orders were even drafted. For the men commanding the vanguard, this philosophy was drilled into every instinct. In peacetime maneuvers, a tank driver felt the surge of a heavy engine and saw the horizon rushing to meet him. The enemy was broken, fleeing in disorganized pockets. This was the textbook definition of armored exploitation. A company commander looked at his map, calculated the top speed of his vehicles, and drew a line 50 miles deep into the enemy rear. He assumed that if his lead tank could move at 25 miles per hour, the entire division behind him was advancing at the exact same rate. In peacetime exercises, if a vehicle blew an engine or threw a track, the crew simply pulled over onto the manicured grass, and the rest of the column smoothly drove past them. But a military map is a dangerous abstraction. It is a flat, two-dimensional surface that lies about the physical properties of the world. An arrow drawn in grease pencil, representing 300 tanks and 2,000 support trucks, might be 2 inches wide on the paper. In reality, that arrow had to squeeze through the unforgiving physical geography of the Earth. A sweeping cavalry charge of the 19th century could spread out across a mile-wide front, galloping over fields, crop lines, and open pastures. A mechanized army of the 20th century could not. Heavy tanks, fuel bozers, bridging equipment, and ammunition trucks weighed anywhere from 10 to 40 tons. Off-road travel was a punishing, slow-motion affair that consumed massive quantities of fuel. 30 tons of steel would instantly sink into autumn mud. Military doctrine dictated that once the crust of the enemy defense was pierced, the armor was to run wild in the strategic depth. shatter the axles of wheeled supply trucks on uneven ground, or destroy suspensions in deep forests. An armored division was, therefore, entirely bound to the existing road network. More often than not, this meant a single, unpaved farm track, originally designed for wooden carts. This was the fatal logistical reality missing from the sand tables. An armored division was not a broad wave washing over the landscape. It was an incredibly dense, heavy mass of machinery, forced under high pressure through a narrow, fragile pipe. The speed of the breakthrough was not determined by the horsepower of the lead tank. It was determined by the physical capacity of the dirt track beneath it. The moment the vanguard punched through, a terrifying mathematical equation took over, and that equation began the second the first piece of heavy armor stopped moving. A typical rural European road in the 1940s was often no more than 12 to 15 feet wide. A medium tank was nearly 10 feet across. Flanking this narrow strip of compacted dirt were steep drainage ditches, dense hedgerows, or soft, waterlogged agricultural fields. When an advancing armored column committed to one of these routes, it lost the freedom of the open plain. It became a heavy train locked onto a single, unforgiving track. An armored division on the march was a terrifyingly massive object. The objective was to slice communication wires, overrun supply depots, and paralyze the enemy command before they could form a new line. 2,000 vehicles ranging from command scout cars to heavy supply trucks had to be precisely managed. To minimize the catastrophic threat of enemy strafing runs, standard doctrine required drivers to maintain a 50-yard interval between vehicles. Extended like this, a single division could stretch along the road for 30 miles. If the column moved at a steady 10 miles per hour, the system breathed. The vanguard moved forward, and the tail followed in synchronized rhythm. But this momentum relied on a highly dangerous assumption that every engine, gearbox, and steel track link in the leading elements would endure the brutal mechanical strain of a sustained advance. In reality, tanks were inherently self-destructing machines. Imagine the third tank in a leading battalion. Its driver shifts gears, but the overstressed transmission suddenly binds. The gearbox violently seizes, filling the cramped fighting compartment with the acrid smell of burnt oil and sheared metal. The 30-ton machine shudders, loses all forward momentum, and stops dead, angled slightly across the center of the road. The tank immediately behind it hits the brakes. Its driver cannot easily bypass the wreck. Pulling off the shoulder into the muddy ditch means sinking up to the sponsons and becoming permanently stuck himself. He stops in the road. 50 yards behind him, a heavy truck loaded with high-explosive artillery shells grinds to a halt. The accordion effect begins. A shockwave of deceleration travels backward down the column, faster than a radio transmission. The only rule for the vanguard was to keep moving. By mid-afternoon, the company had driven 25 miles beyond the original front. Within 15 minutes, the protective 50-yard gaps entirely evaporate. Thousands of vehicles compress against one another, engines idle, overheating in the dust. The division is no longer a weapon of deep exploitation. It is a 30-mile-long traffic jam, highly visible from the air, sitting completely paralyzed in hostile territory. This is the mathematics of the bottleneck. 10 miles ahead, the surviving vanguard company from our opening scene continues driving into the open country, completely unaware that their supply line has just snapped. 10 miles behind the breakdown, frustrated staff officers scream into their radios, demanding to know why the advance has stalled. Not a single enemy shell has fallen. Not a single ambush has been triggered. Yet, the division has been neutralized just as effectively, as if it had struck a fortress wall. The sweeping operational arrows on the general's map mean nothing until that dead weight is removed. But the physical reality of the road makes this exceptionally difficult. You cannot push a seized 30-ton tank out of the way with a 2-ton supply truck, and the massive recovery vehicles designed to tow it are trapped somewhere in the middle of the very traffic jam the broken tank just created. To survive the brutal friction of a breakthrough, an army had to possess a way to unblock its own arteries. The entire speed of the offensive now rested on a hidden network of battlefield triage. The question was how a military force could systematically clear. The gunners relaxed their cramped grips on the elevation wheels. The drivers opened their heavy steel hatches to let the brutal, suffocating heat vent from the transmission compartments. A massive steel roadblock when the road itself was the cage, and the window for victory was rapidly closing. The solution to the bottleneck began long before the division ever crossed the line of departure. Armies that mastered deep exploitation did not treat mechanics as an afterthought, relegated to the rear echelons. They treated them as the vascular surgeons of the advance. In a properly organized armored column, heavy recovery crews did not wait safely behind the supply trucks. They rode directly in the heat and dust of the front, embedded just yards behind the fighting vanguard. When the seized tank blocked the narrow dirt road, the recovery unit did not wait for orders from division command. They moved immediately. Grinding up from the immediate rear was a specialized, ungainly machine, an armored recovery vehicle. Often built on the stripped chassis of an obsolete tank, it carried no main gun. Instead, it was dominated by a heavy steel boom, a 60,000-pound mechanical winch, and thick coils of braided wire rope. The mechanics who spilled out of the vehicle worked frantically in the suffocating heat, their uniforms soaked in sweat and black grease. They were undeniably winning, but as the sun began to drop, the fuel gauges neared the red line. Their task was not to fix the broken tank. A roadside repair was a fatal misunderstanding of operational momentum. Their only imperative was to clear the artery. The recovery commander had to make a ruthless, split-second calculation of battlefield triage. If the transmission could be quickly disconnected, allowing the heavy steel tracks to roll freely, the mechanics would wrestle heavy tow bars into place. They would lock the dead tank to the wrecker and drag it forward, desperately searching for a wide shoulder, a shallow field, or a ruined farmyard where it could be parked out of the way. But if the tracks were locked, or the ground was too soft, to risk moving the wrecker off the road, the doctrine became brutal. The mechanics would hook the winch cables to the towing eyes of the paralyzed machine. The wrecker's engine would roar at maximum revolutions, spewing thick exhaust into the air, with a terrible screeching of tearing earth and strained steel. They would deliberately drag the 30-ton tank directly off the road, sacrificing the vehicle by burying it in a deep, waterlogged ditch. The army was completely willing to abandon a valuable weapon if it meant saving the momentum of the division. Only when the obstacle was entirely cleared did the military police blow their whistles. The endless line of idling trucks shifted into gear.